Hello everyone, this is Nicolina from Market 7. We would like to thank you all for attending today's webinar on deriving absolute value from your contingent workforce, brought to you in partnership with Workspend. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, there are multiple application widgets you can use. All widgets are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the Q&A widget. We will try to answer as many as possible during the webinar, but if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, we'll make sure to follow up with you in a separate email after the webinar. A copy of today's slide deck and additional help materials are available in the resource list. We encourage you to download any resources you may find useful. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. Also, a reminder to look out for an email within the next 2 hours with links to download today's material. So without any further delay, let's get started. I'll hand you over now to Patrick.
Hello everyone, I'm Patrick Chartrand, your webinar host. As a friendly reminder, the format for our webinar is a Q&A, and our presenter is Dan Rothberg, President of Workspend. And so I'll be asking Dan questions throughout our time together, and we'll also be using a PowerPoint as a guide simply to follow along. You can expect Dan to receive 1 or 2 questions for each PowerPoint slide. With this in mind, let's get started. Dan Rothberg is the President of Workspend, an MSP with a unique and modularized approach to managed services that focuses on the components of a company's MSP program and how it fits and evolves near and long-term with other labor categories. Dan joined Workspend in 2016 as Senior Vice President of Strategy and Operations and has been instrumental in driving the company's growth as a leading MSP solutions provider. Dan, welcome and thanks for your time.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm excited to be here and taking part in this today, so looking forward to it. Thank you.
All right. Let's get over to the agenda. All right, webinar participants, and now to the agenda. The first section we'll cover will be our introduction. We'll focus on a few definitions to ensure that webinar participants are set up for the rest of the discussion. The second section, value add throughout the economic cycle, will be the crux of our discussion. Dan will discuss different areas of the business cycle and specifically how MSPs have innovated and serviced their clients' needs in these different environments. And finally, our last sections, furthering our abstract and conclusions. We'll provide webinar registrants with a few considerations as to where we are in the economic cycle, how to become business cycle agnostic, and how to continually optimize their contingent workforce. All right, let's get started. Okay, the first slide in our introductory section is definitions in context. And for those of you listening through audio only, we're in slide 1 of 2. The first question that we have for Dan is, we have audience members, Dan, of varying expertise and familiarity with what a managed service provider is and does. If you could perhaps start the session off by providing a high-level overview addressing this, it would be much appreciated.
Absolutely. So in the labor space, an MSP is a company that takes on primary responsibility for managing an organization's contingent or non-full-time labor force. And the key components of this include fulfillment, reporting, on-offboarding, supplier management, compliance, governance, and pay bill. And as this definition has kind of evolved, it's also starting to take on other aspects of labor. So direct hiring programs are falling under this, as well as statements of work program, freelance, and that sort of thing. And really, as the definition, it really started as a tactical solution, primarily transactional. Today, it's really becoming more of a strategic component of an organization's overall labor strategy. And then as we go forward, we're really looking at a much more consultative, strategic relationship with clients. So that is what the definition at a high level is today.
Okay. And so obviously as a follow-up, and as you've alluded to, the next question would be, that definition of an MSP has changed over time. So if you can shed some light on how the definition has changed and perhaps why it's evolved the way it has. And additionally, if you can highlight what you expect that future state of an MSP to look like, it would be appreciated.
Certainly, and I think as you talk about where the MSP has been and where it's going, you really need to kind of understand where it all started from. And when you go back and you look at the 90s and the evolution of the Internet, and we had the dot-com boom, and a lot of organizations at the same time were going through initiatives to implement large ERPs, there was a tremendous need for talent, primarily in the technical space. And so organizations were working with a large number of staffing suppliers to draw in this talent. And the strategy at the time was really to cast a very wide net, to work with as many suppliers who had access to a lot of labor out there. And you have to remember at this time that the Internet-based recruiting was really just getting started, and so it was still very much traditional means of advertising, candidate outreach, and those sorts of things. However, as we've evolved and technology's advanced, we're starting to see it be a much more strategic approach to labor as a whole. And part of this is being driven by really one of the drivers and the enablers of the MSP is the technology. And that technology is a vendor management system, or VMS as we typically refer to it in the industry. And we've seen tremendous advancement within the VMS landscape, which has really drawn in a lot of additional data points, been able to more effectively and efficiently manage the overall activity. And so as we advance, the MSP is now taking on a much more strategic role within the overall environment of a client's talent strategy. The other part that's really driving this is that as the industry's advanced, we're starting to see clients that are engaging in second and third generation MSPs, which is becoming a much more strategic type of model for them. And really, as we kind of go forward, we really see the strategy and the use of data and the analytics is going to continue to drive the industry forward, allowing clients to really look at it strategically, take a total talent solution to see how the contingent workforce, how that non-full-time workforce interacts with and impacts the full-time workforce, and how you really put all the pieces together to get the work that needs to be completed done.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, for those of you listening, we're now on Definitions in Context, slide 2 of 2, and I'd like to start this slide out with the definition of what absolute value means for us. And it means generating enhanced business outcomes regardless of the business environment in which the MSP operates. Dan, can you provide us with an example of that?
Certainly. So one of the things that we really do and with absolute value is we're always looking for ways to help our clients and to bring value to them. And a good example of this is back in 2008, the economy was in a pretty difficult point, and we had a client that had up to that point historically gone through a number of layoffs and cuts. And what we really noticed in the data is that each time they would do that, very shortly thereafter, we would see an uptick in the hiring cycle for contingent labor. And this indicated to us that the reaction was always perhaps maybe a little bit more extreme than what was necessary to maintain the business. And so leveraging that data, when that started to happen, we would start really building a pool of candidates. And then when they went through that cut, which was fairly substantial in 2008, immediately thereafter, they had a need to add talent because they'd cut too deep and they were struggling to get the work completed. We were ready and able to immediately fill that need. And so that's an example of kind of how we're leveraging data and looking forward to make sure that we're always prepared to meet the needs of our clients.
Okay. And Dan, as a final question for the introductory section, for these definitions in context, some labor types are impacted differently, as you've alluded to, or are uncorrelated completely from the economic cycle. So as a preface for the remainder of the discussion, can you share a few examples from your experience of such things like that as well?
Yes. So there are always industries, and whether the economic cycle is going up or going down, there's always industries that are going to basically operate in reverse. They're going to have an opposite trend. And so we really have historically seen that. But beyond that, even clients that we work with that follow the economic cycle, from their business activity, we always will see a group of skill sets or a segment that will continue to remain strong. And it changes based on where we're at. And to give you an example today, so many of the customers that we're working with are really advancing and creating their digital strategies, and whether they're transitioning their overall business model, their sales model to a digitized strategy, or they're working on it on a department-by-department basis. So we work a lot within the procurement space. A lot of procurement departments right now are going through, a digital transformation. So those skill sets associated with cloud and digital are remaining strong today, regardless of what we're seeing either in the industry or in the economic cycle. And we've historically seen this in various ways across the last 15, 20 years in the industry.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, Dan. And what we'll do now, Dan, is we'll actually transition over to the modularized approach comparison slide. Okay, so for those of you listening from the audio only, we're now looking at modularized approach comparison slide. And Dan, I just have one question on this slide for you. So in order to remain competitive, MSPs have had to modify their approach to the market's needs. Can you share more about what a modularized approach to managed services is and how it compares to the traditional MSP solution suite?
When you look at again, going back to the history of the MSP and what was involved to create the technology and to build it, initially the MSPs were really geared for programs that were spending more than $100 million a year in contingent labor. And so that was the focus. And those large organizations were really looking for and had a need for the full suite of services that an MSP provides. And when you look at the slide, you see, basically 10 different buckets or 10 different high-level offerings that an MSP delivers. What started to happen is that due to VMS technology advancements and just the general market as a whole and the way that different clients are leveraging and embracing contingent labor, the space that we call the mid-market has opened up. And that's going to be MSPs that really range anywhere from $5 million up to $75 million in annual spend. And because of that, it's created a different need for clients that don't necessarily want all of the services that an MSP offers. And so what the modularized approach really does is it creates a solution that enables clients to leverage the program options that they both need and they want. And so by being able to choose that and match up with their culture, it really provides a better, scalable, more flexible solution.
Okay, wonderful. And what we'll do next, too, is the next slide will cover a more closer, in-depth look at what that means. All right, so now we're looking at a closer look of what a modularized approach means from an MSP perspective. But then, just to confirm for audience members, what have been the primary reasons for clients to transition from that traditional MSP suite you mentioned to a more modularized approach? And as a follow-up to that, are there specific modules in your experience that have become more attractive to clients seeking that modularized approach?
Sure, and I think that there's a lot of different reasons that this approach has become attractive to clients. We mentioned the mid-market client with the mid-market level of spend. That's certainly one area. But the other things that are really in consideration is what is the culture of that organization? What really fits within their environment in terms of the departments and the HR and procurement? How are they actually using labor and what are their labor categories? So when you look at, for example, low bill rate, more commoditized skill sets that are out there, that doesn't necessitate perhaps the full suite of services. So clients, and we're seeing a lot in the manufacturing space today, and other light industrial areas, the full solution does not fit very well there. Spend affordability. Again, when you get down into some of the more commoditized skill sets, there's not as much margin for suppliers to work with in a supplier-funded model. And so the affordability factor, by being able to only deliver the modules and the services that really are a good fit for that client's need. And lastly, one other key area is oftentimes it's a means of adoption and somewhat of a pilot approach to it. Some clients feel more comfortable starting a bit slower and a bit smaller and then advancing the overall solution. So that is, one reason we're seeing a lot of clients kind of get into the MSP space, particularly in the mid-market. When you look at what some of the key areas are that we really see across the board, that a lot of clients are drawn to is obviously implementation. Implementing a program can be time-consuming, and the experience that an MSP brings certainly lends itself well to that. Technology, VMS, vast majority of solutions leverage a VMS technology, and so the technology. Supplier management is another area. The sourcing strategy, analytics is another big one. And I think as you look at the slide here, one of the things that it shows around, kind of the implementation is that there's really subcategories to each of these modules. And so when you talk about supplier management, that is one area where, we may do the supplier onboarding, but the actual contract and the pay bill may happen at the client side. So as you look at some of the different areas here, and the implementation is another good example of that, you can break those out a little bit to add the most value.
All right, great, perfect. So this kind of concludes that introductory portion of the discussion, and what we'll do next, Dan, is we'll get into the crux of the discussion, which will begin with the economic cycle in context. So as previously discussed, what we'll be doing now is highlighting different sections of this economic cycle. For example, the peak and recession, the trough and recovery, and we'll be asking Dan questions on each section revolving around innovation, market demand, etc., from an MSP perspective. Okay, for those of you listening on audio only, we're now on the modularized approach to down cycle plus trough slide. And we do have a few questions and follow-ups for Dan. And so Dan, in the down cycle and trough of a business cycle, how do modularized approach MSPs generate enhanced and scalable business outcomes?
I think the first thing, which is pretty straightforward, is just the scalability of the modularized approach as it relates to a down cycle. It's much easier to remove certain services or certain modules that are not necessarily needed to be able to contract. And I think the MSP as a whole, I think the scalability is obviously a key component of it, to be able to contract and expand based on what the business environment is.
Okay. And maybe sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Patrick. And then beyond that, just again the ability to unplug certain things, which can save money for the client, for suppliers and supplier-funded model, and really kind of refocus the effort where it needs to be during that time.
And just as a quick follow-up, Dan, and thanks for that, how about in comparison to a traditional MSP solution offering?
So I think when you look at the traditional MSP, one of the things you have to consider is the model, the business model, the pricing model of the MSP. And so when you look at that, most MSPs are a supplier-funded percentage of revenue-based model. And so when you get into a down cycle, what begins to happen is, in most cases, that contingent workforce begins to contract, and that revenue of the MSP begins to contract. And so what is that MSP going to do? How are they going to react to that in the traditional model? And typically in the traditional model, you have a program team or an MSP team that is responsible for all aspects of the service. And so when you start to remove those team members, the service level suffers. In the modular approach, what you're doing is some of those services are basically in a shared model and specific to the service. And so when you have the need to contract and you may remove some of those modules in the down cycle, you're not impacting the other elements of service that would result from just a loss of overall people supporting and delivering service to the account.
Okay. And as a follow-up to that one, which labor segments would you expect to remain unchanged during a down cycle, and why?
I think this changes a little bit based on where we're at in the overall business environment. We talked a little bit earlier about digitization, and I think that is an area that is continuing to remain strong. And I think as clients really understanding that the down cycle does not last forever, so they're really working on those types of strategies, whether it be digital, whether it be certain things within IT and R&D. So a lot of those skill sets do continue to remain strong. And then we do, continue to have strategies of sourcing and really gaining from that overall labor environment as some of those skills become available in the marketplace, grabbing a hold of them and working with our clients to understand what those needs are going to be and make sure that we're a step ahead of the competition in drawing that talent in.
Okay. And as a final follow-up question for this slide, Dan, in your experience, and you've kind of alluded to this a bit, where should organizations focus their labor strategy in this down cycle in order to optimize their labor force?
I think planning as a whole is very important, and so working with your MSP and your overall labor strategy. What is it going to look like in the short term? What do we need to do from a labor standpoint? Do we do, it's kind of the buy, the build, how much outsourcing is it? Do we really want to focus more on a go-forward strategy? And SOW, what type of mix do we want to have for contingent versus full-time? Where are those skills really best applied, whether it be the contingent versus full-time? What makes more sense to go out there through freelance? And I think as we start to get into the recovery in the economic cycle, sometimes it's a bit of a start-stop situation. And so obviously in working with a contingent labor strategy as part of that, you're able to better buffer that environment. And so I think when you look at your sourcing strategies and planning, these are things that you definitely want to look at during a down cycle.
Perfect. And so Dan, what we'll do now for comparative purposes is we'll look at that upcycle and peak. And so for those of you who are now just listening in audio, we're looking at the slide, Modularized Approach, Upcycle plus Peak. And so we have the same lineup of questions for Dan to run through. So Dan, in the upcycle and peak of a business cycle, how do modularized MSPs generate enhanced and scalable business outcomes for their clients?
I think the first answer is really going to be the same as the down, and that's it's scalable. So as we go through recovery and expansion, there's a general need for labor, and so the ability to scale quickly is certainly important. And so I think that's one area, but also, again, the inverse of the down cycle is the ability to quickly plug in other solution offerings. And this oftentimes is driven by what's happening within the full-time structure of that client. As growth begins to happen, it may be challenging to add in certain departments, whether it be in HR or procurement. And so leveraging your contingent MSP and the different modules and being able to plug in additional services, whether it be to come in with a more of a recruitment process outsource solution or a direct hire solution to really help supplement the efforts of, let's say, an HR or sourcing department. Those types of things can add immediate value because the ramp-up time in the contingent space is going to be far quicker than it would be in the full-time space. So I think that's one example of the additional value you get in the upcycle.
And just for comparison purposes, as we did with the last slide, as a follow-up question, how about in comparison to a traditional MSP solution offering in value in upcycle and peak?
So I think that, when you, again, the traditional, it's kind of the same thing again in inverse when you really start to look at that as a whole. So during the down cycle, you stripped out a lot of those resources, from the overall solution, and the MSP can almost get into the same situation in the traditional model as the different departments. It may take time for that MSP to bring those those resources or get the right resources back in place and to ramp up. So again, the modular approach is a more effective, quicker approach, and you may not need everything as you get into that upcycle. You may not need all the same solutions that you had at the previous peak, and so you have the ability to build to match the business from a solution offering perspective.
Okay. And as a follow-up to that, Dan, which labor segments would you expect to remain unchanged during an upcycle, and why?
I think for the most part, we really see growth across the board when we get into an upcycle. The proportions of that can be a little bit different. And, looking at the clerical space and the IT space, during the downside and during the planning and the R&D, a lot of what's happening at that time is that clients, and we're working closely with them to evaluate their labor picture and how can they better leverage technology. So when we look in the IT space and you look in the clerical space, a lot of those remain relatively consistent during the upcycle, in many cases because of technology coming in to make those positions more efficient and having less of a need for some of that labor that existed before. But as a whole, we really do see upticks across the board when we're really in expansion, in the market.
Okay. And as one final question for this slide, Dan, in your experience, where should organizations focus their labor strategy in an upcycle and peak in order to optimize their labor force?
So here it's really, during the down cycle, one of the things we talked about was planning and really understanding what the labor strategy is going to be. When you're in the up cycle, you're really executing on that strategy. And so the focus has to be on we need to execute what we've built out and what we've planned. But we're also going to continue to look at how does that really work within, again, the build and the buy. Do we outsource some of this? Do we leverage more contingent labor? How confident are we in what that expansion in the market is going to look like, and how consistent and will it hold? And I think as you really look at the overall business environment to make those decisions. Also, focus on the work that needs to be done. A lot of organizations really focus on the jobs and the people and the headcount, but really focus on what needs to be completed. What is the work, and what work with your HR department, your MSP, on what the best way to get that work done. And all of that has to be done within consideration of what the skill availability is out there. And this is one thing that happens in the upcycle, is that everybody is going after that same type of labor. We're seeing it, again, going back to the digital transformation today, we're seeing a lot of that in that space where everybody's competing for that same labor. So as you execute your strategy, understand what the availability is and where that availability lies.
Okay, wonderful. And Dan, what we'll do as a final slide for the business economic cycle is that we'll look at a steady state. And so for those of you who are listening on audio only, we're now looking at the slide called Modularized Approach Steady State. And so Dan, question for you in this case is, in a steady state market environment, which could be a little tricky, how do modularized MSPs generate enhanced and scalable business outcomes?
So when we're in a steady state, that's really kind of the ideal situation. And this is where we really want to focus on, what the strategy is and looking at the economic indicators. The MSPs, and I think labor as a whole, is a pretty good predictor of what's happening within the economy. And so we should have a pretty good sense of where things are headed, but we really want to focus on the strategy. We want to focus on what is going on in the labor environment and what are the hot skill sets going to be. And so when we look at the modularized approach, talent sourcing becomes very important. And so looking at what is the sourcing strategy and what are the different levers that we're able to pull from. Looking at the technology and do we have the best technology, and is it remaining relevant, from where we've been and what we've been through in the ups and the downs, and how did that how did that work, and evaluating that and driving forward. And then really working with the clients to figure out what additional areas in that, what other modules can we bring forward, what other approaches can we bring forward based on what's happening within the market from a labor supply and a labor demand standpoint, from a technology standpoint, and really kind of where their business is going as a whole. So I think the steady state is a good opportunity, again, for more evaluation and more planning and more proactive approach to what the future holds.
Okay, and we just have one quick follow-up on this slide, Dan. So, are there any additional outcomes that are unique to this environment as compared to those up and down cycles you previously discussed?
I think the steady state is an opportunity to really focus in on some of the enhanced value streams that businesses don't take the time or really don't have the time to address when we're either declining or accelerating. And so that's what we really want to look at is how do we build out those additional value streams. And I think there's some very creative things that an MSP can do within the labor landscape as a whole to figure out where we can extract some additional value, whether it be savings levers, really looking at how we can improve productivity, different areas there. And a lot of that is really leveraging the data, and the data gives us a lot of opportunities to figure out what additional value streams there are. And so it's a good quiet time, if you will, to really reflect and to really dig into it in depth and build out some of the additional value streams.
Perfect. And so, Dan, and for those of you listening, what we're now going to do is go into a few conclusions that we have with regard to the MSP and the demand that they service throughout the economic business cycle. And so for those of you on audio only, we are on slide 12 of 17, and it's titled Economic Cycle Value Proposition in Context. And I'll just be reading this out. So a few conclusions for you all. We view managed services, especially in larger enterprises, as a highly correlative proxy to the overall health of the economy. We also view managed services in context of our business cycle model as a predictive indicator for the expected near-term health of the economy. And finally, labor categories are impacted differently, or not at all, throughout the economic cycle. Managed services provide information granularity into how to best identify and support business cycle agnostic categories where demand is most competitive. And now we'll transition to the final portion of the presentation. Okay, so now we're in the business cycle in context. Where are we? And Dan, I just have one question for you. Within the business cycle model we just discussed, where do you feel we are in the cycle?
From my perspective, I would say we're in somewhat of a steady state. We're seeing some light growth, but I would say we're in somewhat of a steady state today.
Okay, let's go ahead and delve into that on the next slide. So delving into this a little bit more, and now we're on slide 14 to 17, why do we feel we are where we are in the economic business cycle? Dan, as a question to you and as a follow-up to the last question, why do you feel we are where we are in the business cycle?
Again, from my perspective, when we look at what the economic indicators are out there, and I think we're in a pretty unique environment right now. We've got some unique political influences happening within the business environment today that can be somewhat of a wild card. But when we look at the economic indicators, and we really look at what's happening within our industry and labor as a whole, we're seeing manufacturing be relatively steady. Same with IT, same with clerical, accounting, finance, and professional positions. We are seeing an uptick in digital, some creative, cloud types of things. So we are seeing some upticks within the high-tech space. But overall, when you look at the industry, we're seeing some light growth. And I think what's also very interesting to consider, and we looked at probably a 15-year sample of data, and we looked at hiring trends within the contingent workforce across three main areas. We looked in the high-tech sector, we looked in manufacturing, and we looked in the services. And there is a direct correlation between hiring cycles in the contingent space in those industries and what's happening within what's happened within the economy. So as we look at that predictive model, there is definite correlation there. And so as we talk about that and the hiring cycles that we're seeing today, I think we can confidently say that we're relatively steady today.
Okay. And from your perspective, and I'm very curious to this too, is what sort of services are being requested from an MSP perspective in this steady state?
Right now we're having clients coming to us. They're looking for a lot of data. They're looking for a lot of analytics, a lot of consultation on what the labor strategy looks like. And we talk to clients about total talent management. It's been an industry buzz phrase of ours for several years. Your MSP is your total talent provider. The reality is what clients are really looking to us for is advice on how they leverage labor as a whole. Where should they use contingent labor? How should they leverage SOW, and how should they manage that to get the best value out of it? What is the true application for freelancers? How is that working today? How do they best apply that? And how do they fit it all together within their full-time labor strategy? And so we're getting a lot of that. The key drivers within the MSP continue to be today. Clients are still looking for cost savings, which really is translated to be more around value than just rate-based savings. How can they leverage labor more efficiently? Risk mitigation is still a big area that they want to understand. There's always risks associated with labor, whether it be full-time or contingent. How do they ensure that the programs meet that? And then lastly, again, going back to sourcing, how do they ensure that the talent is going to be available to them to meet their business objectives?
Okay, wonderful. And so, Dan, what I'd like to highlight for folks who may be on audio is that for this one slide, there's an interesting green block that has innovation on it, and what'll be applicable to the next slide, how are we preparing for the next cycle, and we'll delve into that just momentarily. And so for those of you who are listening on audio only, we are now on slide 15 of 17, almost at the tail end of the conversation, and it's how are we preparing for the next cycle. And one of the things highlighted was innovation as an extremely important cog in the wheel for that. So Dan, innovation in your services delivery model and overall solution suite are clearly crucial to remain competitive in this environment. So how are you preparing for the next section of the business cycle?
So obviously, innovation is at the center of it. What's innovation in our industry really look like from a talent standpoint? I think the modular approach is a key component of that because it enables us in working with our clients to focus on what's important, what's relevant for their business. And it changes based on the type of business, and the product or the service that a client may be delivering or working on. So by being able to be relevant with the modular approach is certainly key. Beyond that, technology is playing a key role in the VMS technology and the ability to capture the different data points. But beyond just the overall data points that come out of any client's program is how do you overlay that data with what's happening in the broader market? And that broader market includes other contingent labor programs across the world, as well as the full-time workforce, the candidate supply, demand. All of that really is kind of pulling together and to be this predictive analytics model that's really telling us how we should approach labor, what's available out there, and how we can best utilize it. We're seeing great innovation, and we're driving towards great innovation in SOW and services procurement. And so MSPs are becoming adept in having great capabilities to not only track and not only to facilitate, but to become consultative partners and really look and break apart SOWs to understand the key cost components of that, oftentimes labor being the largest. And then when you look at overall partnerships, we really drive towards more of an ecosystem approach. It's unrealistic in today's environment to believe that one provider can have the best technology across all the different platforms and sourcing streams that are necessary. So the approach from an innovation standpoint is, what does that ecosystem look like? And beyond just the modular approach of the MSP, how do you look at the technology modularly, and how do you plug in different service offerings out there, whether it be a freelance platform or an RPO platform or an ATS, into an overall labor solution? So when you look at innovation, I think the ecosystem approach, as you drive towards more of a total talent approach, is really going to be key in the industry.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. And so, Dan, now what we'll do is we'll conclude the presentation on this next slide, which is how can other folks prepare for the next portion of the cycle? Okay, so now what we're going to look at, and for those of you who are purely on audio, is the final slide of the presentation, which is how can you prepare for the next cycle? And so, Dan, just a few questions for you. And as a follow-up to the last question, how do you believe, based on your experience, that organizations can best prepare themselves for the next part of the cycle?
To start with, I think being proactive. Really work with your different labor providers, whether it be HR on what the talent strategy is there, your MSP, and work with an MSP that really understands the overall labor landscape, not just the traditional contingent labor. So set a good strategy and evaluate that strategy on an ongoing basis. And then always have contingency planning. Be prepared for what could happen within the labor environment, whether that be an uptick in the economy or a downslide in the economy. Understand how you're going to react to that and what your plan is to ensure that you have the right people in place to deliver the products and services that you need to deliver.
Okay. And there's one final follow-up question, Dan. In terms of how do you recommend clients become cycle agnostic with regard to their labor strategy, what would you recommend? Again, I go back to being proactive. Look forward. See what's happening out there. Consider labor availability in planning and where you're going to pull that labor from. Too often, there's a false assumption out there that regardless of whatever strategy we take, regardless of whatever product we want to develop and bring to market, that there is always going to be a supply of labor to design, develop, test, and market. And that's really not the case anymore. And so as a business, you need to plan with HR, you need to plan with your labor sourcing strategy team to really understand and have that as a component of your overall strategy. Because again, assuming that labor is going to be available may not be correct. And by planning, you're able to understand where that labor is available, what skills are available, when it is available, how much of it, and that really can kind of shape your business, your overall business strategy. And I think clients that are winning in today's market are considering that just like anything else, just like where to put a facility, raw materials. They're understanding what the candidate availability is and being able to plan and develop products and bring them to market. Use the data. Excellent.
The data really is out there now today. Your MSPs have it. Across the board, HR has it. There's a lot of opportunities to really understand what the landscape looks like and plan around that.
Well, Dan, that concludes our presentation. We really appreciate hearing your insights, and once again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And so thanks, everyone. Dan and I really appreciate your time. Please do reach out to us on LinkedIn, on email, Twitter, whatever the case may be. Up next, Nicolina will be setting us up for the live Q&A portion of the webinar. We're all looking forward to it. Thanks.